So this week, I'm going to be taking you back to the scientific revolution. As I have mentioned to you several times in class, the movement through history kind of pushes forward and then goes back and pushes forward again. In other words, you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. But the reason we're going back this week, we're going to look more at the scientific revolution as we prepare for the world change that took place under Charles Darwin. We've looked so far at the Enlightenment and the results of the Enlightenment, that is resulting in the Industrial Revolution, and then kind of the opposite of the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Romanticism. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go back, take a deeper look at the scientific revolution and see how it sets the stage for birthing a new world. And to do this, I want to start off by looking at a work of art by Johannes Vermeer. Painted in 1668, it's called the Astronomer. The painting that you're looking at right now is not the particular painting that we're going to look at on the next slide, but in reality is a painting of his hometown, Delft, Holland. So Vermeer grows up in this exceptionally exciting time just before the beginning of the 18th century, right at the ending of the 17th century, the late 1600s. And he's a very unusual artist. There are really only 2 of his paintings that are worth looking at. We'll look at both of them quickly as we set the stage for the scientific revolution. Almost all of his paintings are set in 2 very small rooms in his house in Delft. They show the same furniture, the same decorations and various arrangements, and often they portray the same people, mostly women. But what I want to say here is there's probably no other painter at this time that better captures the zeitgeist of his time. You probably remember what this word zeitgeist means. It means the spirit of the age. This is an age of great exploration. It's an age of great invention. It's a revolution that involves everyone in Western Europe. So take a closer look at this painting. This is his painting called the Astronomer. So what do you see? Well, you see this man who's got his hand on a globe, and he's actually kind of rising from his chair so as to better observe the globe that's in front of him, where the signs of the celestial constellations are laid out on this globe. And in front of him, there's an open book and a compass. He's taking advantage of the powerful sunlight that is flooding in through the window, shedding light on his instruments. And as we get closer, we see this precisely worked rug laid out in the foreground, in very sharp contrast to the simplicity of the kimono. That's a Japanese wardrobe, the kimono that he's wearing. And on the counter behind him, I want us to move back behind him and look on the counter behind him, because we can see here where he's painted into this painting his own name, Vermeer. This is one of the ways you do analysis of a painting. There's a lot more we could say about this painting, but he's called the astronomer here because he's looking at this globe of the astrological signs, and he's contemplating them. Remember what has happened just before his time. The Reformation unleashed this explosion of information, making Martin Luther the first real rock star because of the Gutenberg press. And there are a lot of things that Luther did, but one of the main things he did was to set the stage for a new world where suddenly the Catholic Church was not the only authority in town. The book here is a book that was written by Midius. It's an astronomy and a geography manual, and you can see here very plainly the two paintings that Vermeer has painted that he is most famous for. There's another one too, but these two are two of the three of his most sought after. The one on your left is called the Astronomer, which we've just looked at. The one on the right is called the Geographer. And think about that. That takes into consideration both of the core values of this time. The astronomer looking into the heavens for insight and understanding as to our own dwelling place here on Earth. And then the geographer thinking about navigation and how we move around the planet, perhaps thinking about Magellan or Columbus or other great explorers of his time. The painting that's hanging on the back wall in both of these paintings, you can see it better in the painting of the astronomer. Just to the right of the gentleman that's rising out of his chair is a painting about Moses navigating the way as he leads his people out of Egypt and into the promised land. I wonder sometimes, does Vermeer see a promised land coming? Here are the two men. In my mind, they look pretty much the same. They're probably the same guy. We have no idea who he was. There's some speculation that this possibly is a self-portrait of Vermeer himself. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie that was called The Monument Men. It's based on a true story. It's an exciting movie, and I would highly recommend that you watch it. It's certainly worth your time. But this is not a picture taken from the movie. This is an actual picture taken right at the end of World War II, where the GIs were commissioned to track down all of the stolen works of art that the Nazis had taken and hidden in many different locations, caves and houses and all kinds of places. The photograph that you're looking at here is an actual picture of the discovery and the saving of Vermeer's Astronomer. So we're going to look at 4 of the most famous scientists who really set the stage for the world that we live in today. Remember, please, there were lots of other scientists who played very important roles in this time period, but I want you to look at primarily these 4. First one we're going to look at is Copernicus, and then Galileo, and then Kepler, and then Newton. But I want you especially to remember that it is the Reformation that sets the stage for this, that gives these people a sense of freedom to explore. Do you remember what Martin Luther's original name was? He was born with the name Martin Luther, and he changed Luther to Luther, which means freedom. And this sets the stage for a whole new zeitgeist that people lived in. Copernicus, you can see the dates there, 1473 to 1543. Quite an individual. He was a man of the church. I want to especially say some things about him because he was a church canon, that is, one of the leaders of his church. But he was also a man of science. So I've shown you here in the town where he lived in Poland, his church, and then very close to the church, his laboratory in the tower that you see on the right. That's important information for you to know because history has been rewritten by many scientists today, talking about how horribly the church treated Copernicus. Well, yes, there were some skeptics, but by and large, his views were accepted by the church. His primary book, The Revolutions of Celestial Spheres, was dedicated to Pope Paul III. Inside the church, Copernicus was a canon, that means a church official. Outside the church, he was a mathematician. I think it's important for us to remember when we're reading the history books, we're reading somebody's opinion of what happened back then. And that's why it's important to get varying views of various historical events. Many people believe that the heliocentric theory was immediately rejected by the Catholic Church. That's not the case. Heliocentric meaning that it's the sun that is the center of our solar system, not the Earth. The relationship between the Church and Copernicus is much more complex than a lot of popular historical narratives would suggest. When the Revolutions was initially published, it meant no resistance from the Catholic Church. was not until 73 years later that the church banned this book. And then the ban was lifted in 1835. It's worth noting that there are a lot of historians who will say this, like at Stanford University, that the Catholic Church had no official stance on Copernican teachings when this book was published. Pope Clement VII died about a decade before Copernicus. He's said to have been receptive about Copernicus's ideas and theories. There's no recorded response from Pope Paul III. Phil Waller, an editor of the Catholic World News, also says that Copernicus was in good standing with the church when he died. And he noted that while the heliocentric theory was controversial during Copernicus's lifetime, his work did not cause him any conflict with the Catholic Church. So why am I telling you all this? Because there's this theory that science and religion have always been enemies. That's not really the truth. But it has set the stage for a day today where a lot of people think that today science and religion are enemies. And there are proponents on both sides of that factor. That is, scientists and people of religion who have promoted the fact that the other side is totally evil. Mano Singham published an article in Physics Today in December 2007, disputing the assumptions that Copernicus's ideas were fiercely opposed by the Catholic Church. And all of this is important for us to know because I'm setting the stage for as we move closer to Darwin. In Singham's article, The Copernican Myths, he debunks many assumptions that people regarded the Earth as the center of the universe with pride, and that the Earth was believed to be the center of the universe rather than at the center of the universe, and that the Catholic Church immediately rejected Copernicus' finding. None of those things are true. In fact, as you read through his article, it's interesting to find that Singham states many people felt that removing the Earth from the center was a promotion for humans rather than a demotion. Again, back to Mano Singham's Physics Today, where he wrote this article called The Copernican Myths. Singham is a physicist. This article is published by the American Institute of Physics. And Singham traces the difference between the modern urban legend or folklore that Copernicus had been persecuted by the church from the beginning. It's just not true. I want you to think about some things as we examine this that goes against this legend that Copernicus was in bad standing with the church. Copernicus was actually one of the leaders in the church. Copernicus was urged by both a bishop and a cardinal to publish his book. He dedicated his book to Pope Paul III. For 60 years after his death, this book was taught in Catholic universities. Now, if the Catholic Church was so much against this book, why did they do that? It was not until nearly 70 years after his death that the book was finally banned. In 1616, the Catholic Church did ban this book, but that's over 60 years after Copernicus's death. He writes this dedication in his book. He wrote a lot of books, but I'm talking about his most influential book, The Revolutions of Celestial Spheres, that is, the planets. To His Holiness Pope Paul III, Nicholas Copernicus's preface to his book on the revolutions. And he says, "It is my loving duty to seek the truth in all things, insofar as God has granted that to human reason." The next person that we're going to talk about is perhaps the next most influential man, and that's Galileo. By the time Galileo comes around, the church is in the process of persecuting scientists. At the death of Copernicus, after it's published, some years after it's published, then comes Galileo. And Galileo is also a strong Catholic. Let's look on the map of Western Europe here to see where these guys are from. The first guy we studied, Copernicus, we've got him listed here up in northern Germany, which actually became Poland. The next individual that we're looking at is Galileo, and he's down in Italy. Galileo wanted to be a monk. It's interesting how these things worked out. Darwin wanted to be a preacher at first. Galileo constructed a telescope. Galileo supported Copernican theory. And he developed a universal law of acceleration. He suffered house arrest for heresy. Galileo is often looked at today as the father of modern science. It is true that by the time he started publishing, the Catholic Church was increasingly becoming anti-science. Part of this had to do with the fact that the church was having to deal with at least two revolts. There was the Protestant Reformation and there was the English Reformation, and the church was just buckling down, putting its seatbelt on, and trying to find a place to really stand. Unfortunately, at that time, it was anti-science. I love some of Galileo's quotations. "Where the senses fail us, reason must step in." March 12, 1610, Galileo's first book appears, and it's called The Starry Messenger. Later, we're going to be looking at a famous artist called Vincent van Gogh, and I can't help but wonder if some of his paintings, especially his painting Starry Night, was kind of a reflection of Galileo. But by the time of 1610, and by the time Galileo's coming around, religious culture is changing in Italy. The Catholic Reformation is in high gear. During the latter part of the Catholic Reformation, attitudes began to change towards science, and the Vatican became more intolerant of new scientific inventions. That is not the case today. In fact, the Vatican owns its own observatory and scientific laboratory for studying the heavens. But it is true then that religion, the Catholic Church, was a wall against science. And science began to break through that wall. We're in the same kind of zeitgeist today where people, it's like they're having to choose between science and religion. And we've created this false choice fallacy that it's either religion or science. But then why can't it be both? Religion and science have been in a needless war ever since the time of Galileo. Galileo was placed under house arrest. He was tried, convicted. He withdrew his thoughts in front of the Catholic Inquisition about science. It is said, though, that as he withdrew his thoughts about the earth moving around the sun, there are those who said they could hear him mutter under his breath, and yet it moves. I love his quotation, "The Bible is a book dictated by God. Nature is a book created by God. Both have common origin, and both have equal authority." In the same way that science has changed and been modified and updated and evolved, so has our understanding of theology. It is not exactly the case that scientific theories that evolved hundreds of years ago are kept today. Many of them have been discarded. In fact, I think the average life for a science textbook these days is about 18 months because science keeps updating as it learns new information. Such is the case with theology. Probably both science and theology need more humility to admit that at this point, no one knows everything.